Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. And today I want to talk about what is the Rick Beato effect. And before we jump into that, I'm sure that if you're watching this channel, you know who Rick Beato is because he is the OG of music analysis videos on this platform. He's by all means a great guy. He's someone that is a bona fide musician inside and out in terms of music theory, in terms of music performance, in terms of composition, in terms of production. He is the real deal, and he earned his right to sort of present himself that way. Now, Rick does many things with his music channel. He educates about music theory, particularly on the guitar, but occasionally on piano as well. Especially in the last year or so, last couple of years, has been interviewing some real legends of music. He's known for his What Makes the Song Great series. It's just anything that's music related he delves into, and he's inspired many other channels to just form where people can talk about music or analyze it or just, present new ideas about music to the wider public. Now, when I say the Rick Beato effect, I'm not talking about his effect on music education, which I'm 100% certain is a positive one. People buy his books. The books are instructive on how to play an instrument, how to develop your pitch, how to sight read, all of that stuff. So I'm sure he's having a big effect there, but the effect I want to talk about is on listening habits. And this is because pop music has always been a music that's been very much of a certain time. And to understand what that means, let's contrast that with music that is not pop music. Let's start with European classical music. So, everyone knows who Beethoven is, and loads of people, more than you think, still listen to Beethoven a lot. Now, Beethoven died in the 1820s. The people listening to Beethoven today, the people listening to Beethoven 150 years ago, weren't from Beethoven's specific era. They weren't from his lifetime, and yet they listened to him. The same goes to any major classical composer, Brahms, Tchaikovsky, Mozart, Bach. The list goes on. In the case of Bach, you could argue that he became much more renowned long after his death than he was in his lifetime. That's generally the opposite of pop music. And even folk music, sort of national folk music of any given country, that tends to be multi-generational because the appeal there isn't because it's the latest and greatest, but because it's an artifact that helps to preserve culture. Now, pop music is different because pop music just means the popular music of the day. And that second part of the sentence of the day is really most important. So, in the 1940s, they loved Glenn Miller. But then Glenn Miller died and generations moved on. In the late 40s and into the 50s, Frank Sinatra was huge. Sinatra's actually probably a bad example because he did have appeal across the decades, but you get the drift. The Beatles, which were the coolest band for the people that grew up with them, young kids today might not react to them as, oh, that's kind of old, they might say. Some might even not like it. And vice versa. If you grew up with Frank Sinatra, you probably thought the Beatles were crass and loud or crude. And if you grew up with, let's say, Journey and REO Speedwagon, you might not think much of Cardi B and Taylor Swift. It's again, every generation blames the one before, as Mike and the Mechanic said. And I don't know if the young children know who Mike and the Mechanics are, but there you go. So what Rick Beato is doing is sort of throwing he's throwing a stone into the wormhole, if you will. He's challenging this notion that pop music has to have a limited lifespan. And he's doing it in a very interesting way. He's not saying that you should listen to this music because my generation listened to it. He's not saying that you should listen to this music because your music sucks. I don't know if you remember that South Park episode where Stan starts to hear the sort of, they called it tween wave, like teeny bopper music, as, someone defecating rather than the music. And the whole joke was about, oh, are boomers right? And that their pop music was better than sort of the millennial and Gen Z pop pop music. Very funny episode from a few years back. So Rick isn't doing that. What Rick is doing that I find ingenious is that he's presenting the music on the basis of its musicality, of its technicality, of its position as one artistic artifact telling the story of artistic development over the years. And I think that presenting it in this sort of manner that's agnostic in terms of time and agnostic in terms of its cultural impact is actually going to see younger people listen to some of this older music, because what Rick is doing is he's removing the stigma of, oh, this reminds me of my lame uncle who had a smelly old Dodge that we had to ride in the back seat on. I think, do Gen Z even know what a Dodge is? Yeah, so there's that. And the other thing is he's detaching it from the cultural attributes. So, in other words, he could play a song from the late 60s. He doesn't need to say, oh, this was written about the Vietnam War. His analysis really leaves the lyrics and the context of when the song was written behind. Quite the opposite of what I do on this channel, which is, hey, I think it's complimentary. But I think what's so interesting about that is that it allows the music to speak for itself. When you put these chords together, it makes you feel a certain way. It sounds a certain way that makes me feel good or makes me emote or reminds me of things that I've experienced emotionally. And that exists outside of the context of any particular era. And I think that even if young people might be approaching Rick's channel without specific knowledge in music theory, some are approaching his channel to learn it, some are genuinely just approaching it from a music appreciation perspective. I think that he, in introducing this music in this particular way, a certain cohort of the young generations, let's just stick with Gen Z, but it could also be the millennials. I think that they might be turning into Spotify and listening to some of this music for the first time, putting it on a playlist, listening to it with frequency, because he presents it with fresh ears and from a fresh perspective. And if the proof need be in the pudding, if you go to Spotify and type in Rick Beato, you will see loads of playlists that are all based on the songs that he's covered in one form or another on his channel. And since Spotify's user base definitely trends sort of to the young to the middle age, not many sort of people with wheelchairs and canes, the older folks on it as much, even though it is a pretty user-friendly platform. This could well mean that the younger people are getting turned on to this music, which I think is a very interesting thing. Because when pop music is good enough to stand on its merits, it needn't fall because its era has passed. Let it stand on its own, just like folk music on the one side of the political spectrum and classical music on the other. But that's my opinion. Let me know what you think. Like, subscribe to this channel, and we will see you next time. Take care.